Okay, this morning we welcome Richard Van Wickler, who is retired superintendent of the King County Jail in New Hampshire, and served in that capacity for over 20 years. He's also a veteran of the United States military, who served in that capacity for over 20 years as well, I believe. So he's a real practitioner in the criminal justice system and in overseeing incarcerated people. So let me just ask you a few, describe a bit about your own philosophy about how to treat people in prison. I think let's start with that.
Well, thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences. 32 years I have in corrections, and 27 of those years are as the superintendent of a county correctional facility. And we had a great deal of success managing that institution, and we call it success in that the parents and the constituency and the community embraced our mission. We had relatively no litigation over my tenure, which is very unusual for a jail. And we had inmates upon release speak highly about our mission. Now, one would think, how is this possible? And what's astounding to me is that it's possible because in my career, I attended the National Institute of Corrections, which is a line item under the Bureau of Prisons by the federal government that makes available training for small jails and prisons around the country to learn from people who engage in best practices. And all I've done is gone to that school and came back home and put those best practices into play. And one of the #1 complaints that the Federal Bureau of Prisons had was many administrators come here, they enjoy the academy for a week or two, and then they go home and either don't want to implement what they've learned or are unable to implement what they've learned. But our basic structure was based on 6 elements of inmate behavior management, which was a pilot program that I helped develop with the National Institute of Corrections. And the 6 elements are: 1, assess inmate risks and their needs by an objective jail classification person who's trained in the interviewing of inmates who are coming in. Assign them to the least restrictive bed space and try to understand what needs they have. Secondly, assign them to appropriate housing. Don't put minimum security people with maximum security people. Don't segregate people that do not need to be segregated. Meet their basic needs. A lot of jail violence occurs because inmates are requesting things or trying to express problems and they're not addressed. Jail problems do not occur suddenly overnight. They build up over time and feel ignored. So meeting the basic needs is #3 on that list of 6. 4 would be to define the expectations that you have for inmates' conduct, both in writing, and display a sense of professionalism. My observation of corrections is that many people are there not because it is a career or a skill set, but it's a job and they're there by default. And unfortunately, a lot of correctional leaders end up there without the academic benefit of the criminal justice point of view for what corrections ought to be or being properly trained for it. So conveying expectations and enforcing those expectations is the 4th. The 5th is to supervise inmates, meaning that in today's jails, a lot of inmates are just left to fend for themselves in the general population, and there's no interaction between jail staff and inmates. And the National Institute of Corrections says this is critically important if you're going to have a well-run institution. And then finally, keep inmates productively occupied. And we do that through programming. What can we do to enhance their reading skills? Do we have programs for them in order to keep them productively occupied? So these 6 elements are the very basics before we get into the brief conversation of segregation and how that works. And to understand that in the criminal justice system, we do not control behavior. This is really important. Police officers and correctional officers are under the impression that they control human behavior. And you cannot, and you will not ever, but you can manage it. And so just having that different perspective of being able to manage human behavior versus trying to control how a person acts or what they think is a lot different. Now let's get to segregation or isolation. Having the opportunity to segregate or isolate in the correctional environment is a critically important tool for the corrections practitioner if it is used correctly. The problem is it is abused. There are only two types of individual that should be in segregation. One is through administrative segregation. That is an individual who demonstrates a harm to themselves, to other people, or the safety and security of the institution. Very loose, doesn't take a lot to put somebody in there, but very important and critical for the superintendent or the warden, a person like me, to keep on top of that and demand to know why somebody's there and why they should stay there. The other, of course, is disciplinary segregation, which requires significant, well, I would say significant due process that is awarded inmates under the federal case of Wolf versus McDonald. And a lot of jails don't follow that, and they should. So having somebody in segregation should be very brief. And what I've learned over my career, in fact, I set in policy, nobody can be segregated for more than 15 days, no matter what. One rare exception would be if they reoffended violently while incarcerated, it could be extended. But if two inmates got into a fight, for an example, a physical altercation, they went to segregation, the most they could receive would be 15 days. And when I first put that plan into place over 20 years ago, people thought I was crazy. They thought, how am I possibly going to run a correctional institution with such loose standards? And the answer is, you don't run a jail very well or at all without inmates' cooperation. Think about it. You're outnumbered all the time. And most jails are understaffed and under-resourced. So you have to have an element of inmate cooperation. And you have a system that is fair, that is precise, and you convey your expectations to that population, they understand it. Now, what is the test about whether or not your segregation system is effective? Let me highlight just 4 situations that we have, 4 pieces of evidence over the course of 20 years with respect to how we manage segregation. We had a peaceful population predominantly over that entire period. So number 1, we were not litigated against. Lawsuits weren't brought against us for most anything. The 1 or 2 that we had were for frivolous issues and dismissed. The absence of having extraction teams is interesting because a lot of jails have to put together a cell extraction team with shields and helmets and riot equipment to pull an inmate from the general population and take them to segregation, or they have to suit up and go into the segregation unit to settle it down. We didn't have to do that. We trained in it. We have all the equipment. And if you hear nothing else that I say today, please hear this. We had not put that equipment on in over 10 years in our institution. That's a maximum security institution holding both federal prisoners from the state of New Hampshire and the state of Vermont for their marshal service. So we didn't handpick our inmates. Our inmates are just as dangerous as all the others. We have the gang members. But the fact is, when you enter in this human interaction aspect, it's much easier. Third, inmates in our institution, when we said you need to go to segregation, voluntarily walked there. They walked there. We didn't have to drag them there. We didn't have to beat them up. We didn't have to assault them because they knew through their incoming orientation that if this occurs, you will be expected to go to the segregation unit. However, you will not be there longer than this period of time, and you will be released accordingly. So this is the difference between trying to control behavior versus trying to manage behavior. They actually walked there willingly, knowing that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that would be good news for them. The final fact is interesting. I had built a new jail and opened it in 2010 and had a large segregation unit, because at least 10% of your bed space should be earmarked for segregation. In the event you have an uprising, that unit sat vacant for the remainder of my employ. We had probably 3 or 4 people in it at any given time. I think the most that we had there at once was 12, which would be less than half of its capacity. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is evidence. Now, I finally, and then I'll turn it back to you all, is the issue of going directly from segregation into the community. There's probably nothing worse as a correctional institution that we can do than that. An individual who is in jail, I don't care who they are, I don't care how bad you think they are, they're frightened and they have concerns. They're frightened and they have concerns over the correctional environment, and they're frightened and they have concerns over the civilian environment. And so it is very important, critical, that before you know an offender is going to be released to the community, that a case management services be involved with connecting them with programmatic services that likely already exist in your community. It's not going to cost the jail anything. These programmatic services exist. And we call it the handshake between being released from prison and the community. And inmates oftentimes don't know how to do this. We all know that there are too many mentally ill people in our correctional institution. Many of those people receive Social Security disability. Well, there's a federal law that when you're in jail for over 30 days, that Social Security disability ends. You no longer get that compensation. And when you're released from prison or jail, you have to apply for it to be reinstated. Well, if this person doesn't know how to do that or where to go, what are we doing? So the final thing is this: are we setting them up for failure to go from an 8x10 cell, likely with having co-occurring disorders in many cases, which is a mental health illness and possibly an addiction, into a community with no oversight or direction, no handshake to the community, no connection to programmatic services? Why are we surprised when they reoffend? So with that, I yield and tried to keep that as brief as I could, sir. Thank you.
I did a great job. And I'd like to follow up now. So Interfaith Action for Human Rights, along with our partners in Maryland, does advocacy, both in Maryland and in Virginia. We write legislation and find sponsors for it in the state legislatures. So our first success in legislation was in 2016, when we wrote what we call a reporting bill. And the background to that bill was that we had come to administrators in the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services and asking them for data about how solitary confinement, or restrictive housing as it's called, is used. And they said they couldn't do that. They said that it would be, they either said they didn't have it readily accessible, it costs a lot of money to get it, or it would cost a lot of money to make it accessible. And we were kind of skeptical of that. I actually, in my career as a rabbi in the congregation, I had served several times as a contract chaplain in several prisons. So one of the things you know when you go into a prison is that people are counted 3 or 4 times a day. They have to know where everyone is. So to tell us they don't know where, if people are in, how many people are in solitary at one time, seemed to me dubious.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Nor is it true. It's not true.
Yeah. Because if they didn't, they have to know where everyone is. And if they don't, they're in deep trouble. So in any case, so we then decided on the legislative route to write legislation that would mandate the department to report annually how solitary or restrictive housing is used. And we asked that they ask the number of people out of the total each year are put in solitary, how many are in multiple times, how many people with serious mental illness are put into restrictive housing, how many people in restrictive housing hurt themselves or attempt to hurt themselves, how many women in the women's facility who are pregnant are put into solitary, and how many people are released directly to the community from solitary. So we found that, and the first report came out in January 2017. We're expecting any day now the report for the previous year, for 2020. But we found out that approximately 50% of the state prison population is in restrictive housing at least once during the year, and that the average length of stay is anywhere from 35 to 50 days, depending on the kind of isolation. There, as Mr. Van Wickler mentioned, there are several different kinds: administrative and disciplinary and protective custody. So so that in itself focused up that, gee, it's used a lot, and people are in there, and that about 20% of the prison population is in restrictive housing more than once during the year. So we see that, it's used a lot. We feel that, and the other background to our work is that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, in their report on defining what torture is and what should be banned, part of the report stated that people who are put in isolation for more than 15 consecutive days is considered an act of torture.
Absolutely.
And it has deleterious effects on both the mental and physical health of a person. So we feel, our goal then was to reduce the amount of time people were put in, since it's used quite extensively and people are in way over the 15-day limit, to limit that. So we've tried to pass bills like that and successively to limit the number of consecutive days a person could be in, and that has, for different reasons, has failed. But the other thing that caught our attention was the number of people that were released directly to the community, which you mentioned. So approximately anywhere from 250 to 300 people each year are released directly to the community from restrictive housing. And we felt that, gee, that was an attainable goal to change that statistic, and because we felt that it's not in anyone's interest to release people directly from restrictive housing. It's not in the interest, as you mentioned, the incarcerated person. It certainly won't help him reenter the community, him or her reenter the community in any successful way. And many people consider it a threat to the community that people are released directly. So, I mean, the most outstanding case like that occurred in Colorado, where someone was released directly from solitary and went and showed up at I believe the director of corrections, the state director of corrections, rang his doorbell, and he opened the door and he shot him. And he shot him dead, actually. So we felt that our present bill, we were almost had it voted out of committee last year, but then COVID hit and the legislature closed. So we're hopeful that it'll get out of committee early this year. But our present bill mandates that the department provide what we call transitional services 6 months prior to release to everyone in restrictive housing. And it calls for a step-down program where people are released gradually, that is given more time out of cell and if they pass each phase, that they given more positive reinforcement, let's put it that way, so that by the end of the 6 months, they're completely out of restrictive housing. And it also calls for a multidisciplinary approach to provide medical and psychological services to people who are in need of those services. And we feel that often many people, and the reason they're there is because they need such services.
That's right.
So the bill calls for providing those services to people in restrictive housing prior to their release. So we're hopeful that this will get passed. We don't think it just seems it's in everyone's interest. These people are going to be released anyway. It's not like, we're keeping them. It's like we're shortening their sentence in any way. It has nothing to do with that. And I think it's in everyone's interest that a person who can leave prison. As you mentioned, it's very, I would imagine, very, if you've been in prison, especially been there a long time, very anxiety producing to how you're going to manage outside of the prison. So I can just tell you one story, and I'll have you can react to what I said. So this is a story. As I mentioned, I served as in different capacities as a chaplain, as a Jewish chaplain in different prisons. And most recently, that's about 5-6 years ago now, I volunteered as a chaplain in the maximum security prison in the state of Maryland, which is in Cumberland, Maryland. And I would go out it's a good 2.5-hour drive from Washington. So I spent, a lot of time on the road just to do this. But I spent an hour and a half or so with men, and I taught them about Judaism. Most of them were not born Jewish. They were interested in Judaism. And I realized one of the reasons they came was that they thought I gave a good talk. Their life there was so devoid of programming, and they really wanted some good intellectual stimulation. But in any case, I became a mentor to one of these men. And for 6 or 7 years, I corresponded with him. And through the mail, I often taught him about Judaism, and and I sent, books and other literature for him to read. It's an interesting case. He was arrested when he was 17 for 3 armed robberies, and he was given a 30-year sentence, 20 years for the armed robberies and 10 years for using a weapon. As far as I know, he didn't kill anybody. In any case, by the time I met him, which was easily a good 15 years that he'd been in prison, he clearly wasn't the same person as he was when he was 17. And he was really wanting to start his life over again. And I think his Judaism attracted him, and still attracts him, because Judaism is lots of structure, lots of rules. And this is something that I think he needed in his life. In any case, so I wrote letters to parole boards for him, because he was up for parole several times. It was denied, we thought, for reasons that didn't make any sense. But in any case, he finally was paroled about 6 weeks ago. And so when he was released to the street without any preparation. He had an address to go to, but when he went to that person decided he really shouldn't stay there.
Now what?
So here he's out on the street. He's been in prison for 23 years. So he knows he didn't have good relations with his family. And so I'm the person he actually knows, in a way. So here I am. He calls me up and says, "What do I do now?" No direction, no resource, no given any guidance, any social resources at all. Fortunately, because of my own connections, I was able to fairly quickly found a place for him. But I had to pay for him to be put up in a hotel for 3 or 4 nights, maybe for about a week, I guess. But I just was astounded that he was given so little preparation when he was released. So this bill hopefully will address that for not only just people in restrictive housing, but for everyone who's in prison who's going to be released. So any comments on that?
Yes. First of all, with respect to the story that you just shared with us, the goals that have been outlined for corrections have been retribution, from the community, incapacitation, rehabilitation, deterrence, both specific and general. But one of the things, and restoration, of course, somehow we're supposed to magically restore people to good tax-paying citizens. But what you brought up that is so important is the issue of reintegration. And if we could envision a future of change, of positive change, it would be a future where reintegration became one of the goals of our correctional system, to make sure that stories like the one that you just shared did not happen, and they indeed happen every day.
Yeah.
So having said that, I'd like to get back to your legislation and the presentation you did on that. Here's something that I think your legislators ought to know when they read that legislation, is that there is nothing inconsistent with what you are asking them to do, inconsistent with the American Correctional Association standards or with the National Institute of Corrections recommendation. It all falls perfectly in line with all of that. The American Correctional Association says in American corrections, inmates are not in jail to be punished. Inmates are in jail as punishment. And we really cannot refer to ourselves as an American correctional system if we're not correcting anything. And the stories that we've shared here gets back to my initial point. You know, it's about how people are not skilled in what they do in the correctional business, right? There's inadequate training. People end up in senior leadership positions by default. They don't have the academic training or understanding of American corrections that is so absolutely necessary if we are to become a better society and a better culture. The legislation is good-spirited and all of that, but beyond that, it is exactly in line with existing standards of adult corrections in this country and recommendations of the National Institute of Corrections. And that should be powerful for the legislators to hear. And I would go anywhere and tell anybody it's way too easy to gang up on somebody and put them in segregation and forget about them. That's not a profession. That's not corrections. You know, that's not doing anything even remotely close to what you're supposed to be doing. And one of the things that we should have as a skill set in this correctional industry is the understanding of human behavior and how to manage aggressive human behavior with appropriate nonviolent de-escalation techniques, which avoids the use of segregation. And I've proven it. It's not a theory. I have proven it.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Before we go, if someone would like to ask a question, you can just, there's a Q&A box there. Certainly feel free to either put it in the chat or in the Q&A, one or the other. Or a remark. Really appreciate it for your time. I'm sorry that the program got messed up a bit, but sometimes things happen that are beyond your control.
Well, I apologize for not being
here
this afternoon. I'm remorseful that I can't be there this afternoon. I'd love to talk to legislators.
So what I hope to do is we're recording your remarks, and I hope I can replay it, your initial presentation at least, during that program. So that's all right, I'll do that.
Absolutely, thank you all so much.
Yeah, okay, I don't see any questions or remarks, so I just want to thank you so much. And I thank those who signed on for the program. I appreciate it. And we will be having with Delegate Jazz Lewis, who's our sponsor of our legislation. We'll be speaking to him at 2 o'clock, and I'll send out a link to the people who signed in case you have time, you'd like to tune in for that. So thank you so much. I'm gonna stop the recording now.